My name is Lynn Wilson. I am 32 years old. Last Saturday night, I stood under the crystal chandeliers of the Berkshire Estate in western Massachusetts, holding a glass of sparkling water. I wore a simple navy dress. I was not there to celebrate. I was there because my mother mailed an invitation to my old post office box with a handwritten demand tucked inside. Patricia spotted me from across the room. She did not walk over to say hello. She did not pull me aside to ask how I had been for the last 10 years. She waited. She waited until a group of the groom's high society relatives drifted toward the ice sculpture, ensuring she had the right audience. Then she raised her champagne flute. "Oh, this is my other daughter," Lynn Patricia announced. She pitched her voice so the surrounding guests could hear every single syllable. She waitresses for a living. Pity rippled through the circle. A few women in designer silk averted their eyes. My sister Jessica stepped into the light. She wore a custom bridal gown covered in imported lace. She linked her arm through our mother's arm and smirked. "At least she is good for something," Jessica said, loud enough to cut through the jazz band playing in the corner. Serving tables. The crowd offered a polite, uncomfortable laugh, the kind of laugh people give when they do not want to challenge a bride. I did not run out of the room. I did not drop my glass. I took a slow sip of water and let the silence hang. I learned a decade ago that when people build a stage to humiliate you, the worst thing you can do is perform the script they wrote. Before I tell you what the groom's father did next, welcome to Grape Vengeance. If you have ever been the invisible child who built an empire in the shadows, you are in the right place. Drop a comment below, tell me your age, where you are watching from, and what local time it is there. Now back to the ballroom. Someone in that circle was not following my mother's script. Richard, the groom's father, stood 3 feet away. He built an East Coast real estate conglomerate from the ground up. He reads rooms for a living. He did not laugh at my sister's joke. His smile vanished. He set his champagne flute down on a passing tray. His eyes locked onto my right hand, specifically the custom gold signet ring resting on my index finger. It is the exact ring worn by the anonymous CEO who had recently saved his corporate events division from a logistical nightmare. A CEO he had dealt with through intermediaries for 3 years. A CEO who owns the very venue Jessica had booked for her wedding. Richard stepped forward. He unbuttoned his tuxedo jacket and looked past Patricia. He looked past the smirk on Jessica's face. He looked directly at me. "Could I speak with you outside?" Richard whispered. He did not wait for an answer. He turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors leading to the courtyard. Patricia frowned. She assumed Richard was taking me outside to scold me for ruining the aesthetic. She thought her narrative was working. She had no idea her golden child was marrying into a family that values arithmetic over illusions. She also had no idea I stopped relying on waitress tips a very long time ago. I set my water glass on the table. I smoothed my dress. I walked out the doors behind him. The courtyard air was crisp. Richard stood by a stone fountain. He held a folded document he had pulled from his jacket pocket. The look in his eyes was no longer polite. It was the look of a man who realized his family was being played. "My corporate team has been dealing with you for 3 years, Richard said. The jazz music faded behind the thick glass. "You are Lynn Wilson. You are the CEO." I nodded once. He looked back toward the ballroom doors, toward the bride, laughing under the chandeliers. He was holding a secret that was about to detonate the entire wedding. Richard stood in the crisp Massachusetts night air, the jazz music muffled behind the thick glass doors of the courtyard. He held the printed email thread in his hand, his eyes moving from my face to the ballroom where my mother was holding court. The wealthy real estate titan had just connected the dots. The anonymous vendor he respected was standing right in front of him, being treated like trash by her own flesh and blood. He asked the only logical question: "Why does your own mother think you serve tables for a living?" I looked at the stone fountain bubbling beside us. To understand the trap Patricia and Jessica just walked into, you have to understand the ledger my mother kept. I told Richard we needed to go back exactly a decade. 10 years ago, the Wilson family lived in a cramped, split-level house in Worcester. I was 22, working double shifts at a local diner to pay for my business degree. My sister Jessica was 24, floating through life on a permanent cloud of our mother's funding. Jessica never kept a job for more than 3 months. She found labor beneath her. One Tuesday afternoon, I came home smelling like fryer grease and stale coffee. I walked through the front door and found my college textbooks stacked in cheap cardboard boxes by the entryway. My notes, my financial calculators, my graded exams, all shoved haphazardly into the dark hall. Patricia was in the kitchen wiping down the counter with a lemon-scented cloth. I asked what she was doing with my school supplies. She did not pause her scrubbing. Jessica needs the hall closet for her new winter wardrobe, my mother stated. She did not look at me. You can keep your school things out in the garage. The garage had a severe leak. The roof dripped directly over the corner she had designated for my education. I stood there taking in the reality of the hierarchy. Jessica was the investment. I was the liability. I moved my heavy boxes to the trunk of my used sedan and kept my mouth shut. I thought endurance would eventually earn me a seat at their table. I assumed hard work would eventually warrant basic respect. I was terribly wrong. The final fracture happened 3 months later during a bitter January freeze. Jessica decided she wanted to open a luxury bridal boutique in downtown Boston. She possessed no retail experience, no vendor connections, and zero inventory strategy. She simply wanted her name painted on a frosted glass window. Patricia invited me to sit at the kitchen table. That was my first warning. I was never invited to sit at the main table unless they needed a favor. Jessica sat across from me, tapping a manicured fingernail against a glossy business proposal. They needed a co-signer for a commercial loan. The bank had already rejected Patricia due to her overextended credit cards. They demanded my signature because I had spent 4 years building a flawless financial record. I opened the proposal. I did not look at the pretty pictures of crystal chandeliers and velvet display racks. I looked directly at the projected profit margins. The math was a spectacular disaster. The overhead costs for the Boston lease alone would bankrupt the LLC within 6 months. The interest rate on the loan was predatory. I slid the folder back across the polished maple table. I cannot sign this, I said quietly. The numbers do not work. You will default and the bank will garnish my wages. Patricia stood up. The wooden chair scraped harshly against the linoleum. Her face hardened into a mask of pure, unfiltered resentment. She did not see a daughter trying to protect her own financial future. She saw a subordinate refusing a direct order. You do not need a calculator to help your sister, Patricia snapped. You just sign the paper. Family helps family. I looked at Jessica. She glared at me, arms crossed over her chest, fully expecting me to fold under the pressure. I stayed seated and stood my ground. The arithmetic says this is a guaranteed failure, I replied. I will not ruin my life for a boutique. Patricia turned on her heel and marched down the narrow hallway to my bedroom. She emerged 2 minutes later carrying my canvas duffel bag. She threw it onto the kitchen floor. The zipper split open. My black work uniform spilled onto the tiles. If you will not fund your sister, you have no family here, Patricia decreed. Her tone held zero hesitation. She was discarding me like an expired coupon. I bent down, gathered my shirts, and shoved them back into the broken bag. I did not argue. I did not beg. I walked out the front door into the freezing wind with $400 in my checking account. I did not look back. For the next 10 years, I kept a very specific ledger of my own. I bought a navy blue binder with thick metal rings. I kept it in the bottom drawer of my desk. Every time I tried to bridge the gap, I documented the rejection. Year 1, I mailed a Mother's Day card. I wanted to see if the anger had cooled. The envelope returned 11 days later with a red stamp smeared across my handwriting. Return to sender. I punched 3 holes in the paper and placed it behind the first tab. Year 2, I called on Thanksgiving. The phone rang 6 times before going to a dial tone. I printed the phone record, circled the duration in red ink, and filed it away. Year 3, Patricia left a single voicemail on my birthday. I saved the audio file on a secure flash drive and printed the official transcription. The text read, "You are a worthless failure, Lynn. Do not ever contact Jessica again." That paper went directly into the binder. 29 items. 10 years of calculated erasure. Patricia thought she had permanently thrown out a diner waitress who would spend the rest of her life scraping by on minimum wage. She was utterly unaware that kicking me out into the cold was the exact catalyst for her own ruin. I finished telling Richard the foundation of the story. The courtyard fountain bubbled quietly beside us, the water catching the pale moonlight. He stared at me, his sharp eyes processing the sheer scale of the deception. "Your mother threw you away over a bad business loan," Richard clarified, his voice tight with rising indignation. "And she genuinely believes you are still serving food?" I took a slow breath of the cold air. "She believes what she wants to believe," I replied. I never corrected her, because the silence protected my peace. If she knew I had money, she would have never stopped knocking on my door. Richard folded the email thread into a neat, precise square. He looked through the glass doors at Jessica. The bride was currently sipping expensive champagne and laughing with his wealthy relatives. The bride who claimed she was a hospitality mogul. The bride who told his entire family she was funding this lavish event from her own successful startup. The realization hit him in heavy, undeniable waves. His son was marrying a parasite. His family was being targeted by grifters. Richard turned back to me, the polished society demeanor vanishing entirely. In its place was the ruthless pragmatism of a self-made billionaire facing a threat to his empire. "How did you get from a broken duffel bag in Worcester to owning the company that manages this entire estate?" he asked. I offered a small clinical smile. "I did it by learning every flaw in their system," I said. "I built my worth in the dark." The jazz quartet inside shifted to a faster tempo. The guests clinked their crystal glasses, wholly oblivious to the storm gathering just outside the walls. The empire I built in the shadows was about to collide with the fraud Jessica had constructed in the light, and the impact was going to be deafening. Richard stared at me under the pale Massachusetts moonlight. The jazz music from the ballroom felt like a distant echo behind the thick glass doors. The wealthy real estate titan had just connected the scattered dots of a decade-long mystery. The anonymous vendor he respected, the CEO, who rescued his corporate events division, was standing right in front of him. And she was being treated like discarded trash by her own flesh and blood. He asked the only logical question any sane person would ask. "How did you get from a broken duffel bag in Worcester to owning the company that manages this entire estate?" I looked at the stone fountain bubbling quietly beside us. I did not stay a waitress. Carrying cheap coffee pots and clearing dirty plates paid for my basic survival during those first few years, but I refused to let that uniform define my ceiling. I aimed much higher. I secured a job serving at the most exclusive event venues across New England. I worked the floor at high society weddings, elite corporate retreats, and charity galas where the floral arrangements alone cost more than my annual rent. I poured vintage champagne for senators, tech founders, and real estate tycoons. While other servers complained about sore feet and demanding guests, I kept my eyes open and my mouth shut. I carried a small leather notebook in my apron pocket. I did not just serve food. I studied the underlying architecture of the events. I watched the chaos unfolding behind the swinging kitchen doors. I mapped out the logistical nightmares that routinely ruined million-dollar evenings. Caterers arriving 3 hours late, transportation companies dispatching the wrong luxury vehicles, event planners sweating over missing linen shipments and misplaced seating charts. The premium hospitality sector in our state operated on a fragile foundation of panic and fragmented communication. Vendors constantly blamed each other when schedules inevitably collapsed. I saw the gap in the market. I realized that wealthy clients do not want excuses or apologies. They want seamless, invisible perfection. By my 25th birthday, I had saved enough cash to file the incorporation paperwork for Wilson Premium Hospitality. I started incredibly small. I coordinated staffing and logistics for boutique corporate retreats. I guaranteed flawless execution, and I delivered every single time. I became the central hub that managed all the moving parts. Word of mouth spread rapidly through the elite circles of Boston and the Berkshires. My company provided the invisible iron structure that made their lavish events run like pristine clockwork. I built the entire enterprise in the dark. I maintained zero social media presence. I authorized no flashy marketing campaigns. I allowed no polished photographs of myself standing in front of fancy venues to be published online. I registered the business through a discreet agent and shielded my identity behind layers of corporate privacy. I kept my old post office box in Worcester active to handle any stray personal mail. I wanted no digital footprint linking the wealthy CEO back to the discarded daughter. The expansion happened faster than I ever anticipated. By age 28, my payroll grew to 60 full-time employees. We handled the transportation fleets, the exclusive catering contracts, the venue management, and the crisis resolution for premium events across the Eastern Seaboard. The revenue scaled exponentially. By my 32nd birthday, Wilson Premium Hospitality grossed over $12 million annually. We held the exclusive logistical contracts for the most highly sought-after historic estates in New England. I purchased a historic brownstone in the heart of Boston. I remember standing in the grand foyer on closing day, holding the heavy brass keys in my hand. The original hardwood floors gleamed in the afternoon light. The high ceilings echoed with a profound sense of quiet security. I bought the property in cash. The very next morning, I sat down with my private attorney, Helen Morrison. I directed Helen to draft a bulletproof, irrevocable trust. I placed the brownstone, my diversified investment portfolios, and my controlling shares of the hospitality firm directly into that secure legal structure. I named myself the sole trustee. I constructed a fortress of paperwork that no toxic relative could ever breach. My family remained entirely ignorant of my reality. To Patricia and Jessica, I was still the disgraced, impoverished daughter serving appetizers for minimum wage. I allowed them to cherish that specific lie. Wealth acts as a powerful magnet for entitled relatives. If my mother discovered I possessed $12 million and a thriving corporate empire, the relentless demands would begin within the hour. She viewed children as financial instruments meant to yield a return on investment. She would have leveraged guilt bloodlines and societal pressure to turn my hard-earned bank accounts into her personal slush fund. I refused to subsidize the very people who threw me onto the freezing street for protecting my own credit score. I judged my worth by my own strict metrics, not by their endless mockery. Let them laugh at my simple navy dress. Let them crack jokes about my waitress uniform. Their disdain kept me safe. When toxic people believe you have nothing of value to offer them, they leave you alone. Silence offered me the ultimate protection, allowing me to build my kingdom without interference. But the invisible wall I built was eventually breached. 9 months ago, my executive team submitted a rigorous bid for a highly coveted logistical contract. A prominent real estate conglomerate needed a streamlined, top-tier vendor to manage their corporate retreats and luxury property galas across the state. That massive conglomerate was owned by Richard, the very man standing next to me by the fountain. My firm won the bid based on pure merit. Wilson Premium Hospitality took over the exclusive management rights for several premier locations in his portfolio, including the prestigious Berkshire estate. Richard and I negotiated the lucrative terms through our respective legal departments. We built a highly profitable, seamless partnership without ever meeting face to face. I knew my sister Jessica was dating his son David. The high society gossip circles overlap with the corporate event world. However, I kept those two spheres strictly isolated. My professional obligations had nothing to do with my sister's romantic choices. I assumed they would marry eventually. I never expected Patricia to weaponize the wedding to settle a perceived debt. 3 weeks ago, I drove to Worcester to check my dusty post office box. Amidst the usual pile of junk mail and generic flyers sat a thick, cream-colored envelope. The return address was printed in elegant gold foil. It was a formal invitation to Jessica and David's wedding. The sheer sight of the expensive stationery made my pulse slow down to a measured rhythm. My mother had not sent me a single birthday card in a decade. She ignored my existence for 10 consecutive years. I opened the envelope standing in the quiet post office lobby. A handwritten note from Patricia slipped out from behind the formal invitation card. The blue ink looped across the heavy paper with arrogant, commanding familiarity. "Family helps family," the note read. "We expect you to handle the catering bill for the reception. It is the least you can do after abandoning us." I stared at the brazen demand. Patricia assumed I had spent the last 10 years hoarding waitressing tips in a shoebox. She wanted to drain my meager life savings to fund her golden child's luxury aesthetic. She thought she was trapping a desperate, lonely daughter who would pay any price just to be allowed back into the room. Then my eyes dropped to the venue listed on the formal invitation, the Berkshire Estate. A cold, sharp realization settled over me, chilling the blood in my veins. Jessica had chosen a venue exclusively managed by Wilson Premium Hospitality. My sister had unknowingly signed a binding vendor contract with the very company I owned. Patricia wanted me to pay the catering bill for a kitchen my own team controlled. They had walked blindly into my territory, wielding a threat they could not back up. I knew instantly that the gold-embossed envelope was not an olive branch. It was a calculated, precise trap designed to make me pay for my own humiliation. Richard stood frozen by the bubbling stone fountain. He stared at me while the heavy weight of my words settled over him. His future daughter-in-law had chosen a luxury venue owned by the very sister she had spent a decade mocking. I explained to Richard exactly what I did the moment I read that gold-embossed invitation 3 weeks ago. I did not throw the thick cardstock into the trash. I did not call my mother to scream into the telephone. I drove back to my historic brownstone in Boston, walked into my home office, and locked the door. I sat down at my mahogany desk and opened my laptop. I logged directly into the secure executive portal of Wilson Premium Hospitality. My fingers tapped across the keyboard with clinical precision. I pulled up the upcoming event manifest for the Berkshire Estate. I sorted the data by date, then by client name. The encrypted file loaded instantly. There it was, a binding, ironclad vendor contract for a 300-person luxury reception. The signature on the digital dotted line belonged to Jessica. I opened the billing ledger. I read the numbers tracking down the screen. The total cost of the evening was staggering. It included top-tier catering, an open premium bar, custom lighting rigs, and a live jazz quartet. The contract stipulated a strict payment schedule. A non-refundable deposit had been processed months ago, but the remaining balance was severely delinquent. The final payment was required before the reception doors opened. I sat back in my leather chair and looked at the handwritten note Patricia had tucked into the invitation. "Family helps family. We expect you to handle the catering bill. It is the least you can do." The sheer arrogance of that demand was breathtaking. My mother genuinely believed I was still living in a cramped apartment in Worcester, scraping together an existence on minimum wage. She assumed I had hoarded a decade of loose waitressing tips in a cheap savings account. She wanted to drain me dry. Patricia viewed my life as a checking account she could overdraft whenever her golden child desired a luxury experience. She expected me to empty my meager life savings to fund a single evening of high society pretending. She had no idea she had unknowingly signed a binding legal agreement with the sister she actively despised. I did not get angry. Anger is a useless emotion when you hold a royal flush. I got clinical. I printed the venue contract, the delinquent billing ledger, and the strict vendor guidelines. I placed them inside a pristine navy blue binder. I decided right then that I would attend the wedding. I was not going to cause a scene during the ceremony. I was going to let the arithmetic do the talking. Earlier this evening, I prepared for the event with the meticulous focus of an auditor walking into a hostile corporate takeover. I did not visit a salon. I did not buy a flashy gown. I selected a simple, perfectly tailored navy dress from my closet. It projected the quiet confidence of a woman holding all the cards. I drove my own car out to the rolling hills of western Massachusetts. I did not use the valet service. I parked in the discreet spot reserved for the property owner near the rear service entrance. When I walked through the heavy front doors of the estate, the transition felt surreal. For 10 years, I had built this hospitality empire from the ground up. I knew the exact dimensions of the grand ballroom. I knew the optimal temperature for the wine cellar. I knew the names of the catering staff currently carrying silver trays of appetizers through the foyer. Several of my employees recognized me immediately. The head concierge, a man who had worked for me for 4 years, widened his eyes when I stepped into the lobby. I caught his gaze and offered a single, subtle shake of my head. Do not acknowledge me. He gave a sharp professional nod and returned to his station. My staff knew the protocol. The CEO was operating undercover. I navigated the crowded foyer, blending in with the wealthy guests arriving for the ceremony. My mother had not spotted me yet. I took the opportunity to conduct a silent, rigorous inspection of the event space. Wilson Premium Hospitality maintains a flawless safety record because our vendor guidelines are incredibly strict. We do not tolerate unauthorized alterations to our historic properties. I walked toward the main ballroom and stopped dead in my tracks. Suspended directly above the central dance floor was a towering, heavy floral installation. Hundreds of imported white roses and thick eucalyptus branches hung from a dense wrought iron grid. The structure was secured to the historic wooden rafters using industrial metal clamps. I knew instantly that this installation was a glaring vendor violation. Our preservation contract explicitly forbids hanging heavy structures from those specific 19th century ceiling beams due to the estate's age and architectural fragility. Any floral arrangements must be freestanding. I pulled out my phone and accessed the event notes on our secure server. Jessica had specifically requested the hanging installation. My venue manager had formally denied the request in writing 2 weeks ago, citing the structural insurance policy. Jessica had ignored the denial. She had hired a blacklisted third-party decorator to sneak into the venue and rig the heavy iron grid while my primary staff was occupied with the catering delivery. She compromised the safety of the entire building just to secure a better background for her wedding photographs. A cold smile crossed my face. The trap was officially set. By violating the structural safety clause, Jessica had instantly triggered a breach of contract protocol. My automated system was already tracking the unpaid catering invoice, and now I had physical proof of a severe liability breach. I slipped my phone back into my purse. I watched the unauthorized decorator hurrying to pack away his tall ladders before the guests entered the main room. Jessica thought she had outsmarted the venue management. She thought the rules did not apply to her. She thought she was untouchable. I turned away from the ballroom entrance and headed down the long corridor toward the bridal suite. I needed to see the bride. I needed to look into the eyes of the woman who stole my identity and compromised my property. The hallway leading to the bridal suite smelled overwhelmingly of expensive hairspray and chilled champagne. I heard my mother's voice echoing through the heavy wooden door, barking sharp orders at a terrified makeup artist. I did not knock. I turned the brass handle, opened the door, and stepped inside. The room went dead silent. 4 bridesmaids in matching blush gowns turned to stare at me. Jessica sat in front of a gilded vanity mirror, her custom lace gown spilling over the chair like a white waterfall. Patricia stood beside her, holding a clipboard packed with schedules and receipts. My mother looked at my simple navy dress. Her eyes narrowed into slits of pure, calculated disdain. She did not offer a greeting. She did not offer a hug. She did not ask how my drive was. She marched directly across the thick carpet. She grabbed my arm with bruising force and yanked me toward the secluded corner of the dressing room, away from the listening ears of the bridesmaids. She was holding a piece of paper in her free hand. It was the final venue invoice. The trap was ready to spring, and she was stepping right onto the trigger. The heavy oak door glided shut behind me, sealing off the soft jazz echoing from the main hallway. The bridal suite smelled of aerosol hairspray, wilted white lilies, and spilled champagne. 4 bridesmaids in identical blush silk gowns hovered near the tall vanity mirrors, adjusting their hair and reapplying lip gloss. The room buzzed with the frantic, manufactured energy of an expensive wedding running slightly behind schedule. Jessica sat in the center of the room. A makeup artist carefully dusted shimmer powder across her cheekbones. My sister wore a custom gown that cascaded over the edges of a velvet chair in waves of imported lace. She caught my reflection in the mirror. A slow, triumphant smirk spread across her face. She thought I had arrived to surrender. She thought I had come to beg for my seat at her table. Patricia stood near the metal garment racks in the corner. She wore an emerald green mother-of-the-bride dress that strained at the seams. She held a thick acrylic clipboard packed with vendor schedules and seating charts. She did not say hello. She did not ask about my drive from Boston. She did not ask how I had spent the last 10 years of my life. She marched across the thick carpet, her heels dug into the fibers with sharp, determined steps. She reached out and grabbed my elbow. Her fingernails pressed into my skin through the fabric of my navy dress. She pulled me toward the far corner of the suite, away from the listening ears of the bridesmaids and the makeup artist. She shoved a piece of paper directly against my chest. I caught it before it dropped to the floor. It was a formal billing invoice printed on premium, heavyweight stock paper. I recognized the paper quality immediately because I had personally selected it for my corporate offices 3 years ago. The top left corner displayed the crisp, geometric logo of Wilson Premium Hospitality. The ink was dark and unforgiving. "The final payment is due tonight," Patricia whispered. Her tone held the razor-sharp edge of a woman accustomed to blind compliance. She pitched her voice low, ensuring the bridesmaids could not hear the ugly reality beneath the glamorous facade. "Swipe your card right now." I looked down at the invoice. The total at the bottom of the page read $45,000. The due date was highlighted in red marker by my own accounting department. "If you refuse," Patricia continued, her grip tightening on my arm, "I will walk out there and tell David's wealthy parents that you are a deadbeat who abandoned your own flesh and blood. I will tell them you ruined your sister's wedding because you are bitter and broke. You will never show your face in polite society again." Jessica twisted in her vanity chair, waving the makeup artist away with a flick of her wrist. "Pay the bill, Lynn," she called out, her voice laced with deep entitlement. "You owe us for leaving. Consider it your apology gift." I looked at the invoice again. The irony tasted like cold water. My mother and sisters stood inside a historic building I owned. They drank champagne my logistics team had sourced. They stood on carpets my overnight crew cleaned. And they were threatening to humiliate me over a bill owed to my own corporate bank account. They thought they held a knife to my throat. They were actually holding the sharp edge of the blade with their bare hands. Patricia assumed social pressure would break me. She relied on the old family dynamic, the one where the threat of public embarrassment forced me into silent submission. 10 years ago, the fear of being cast out made me tolerate their endless demands. 10 years ago, I might have panicked. I might have handed over my debit card, drained my meager waitressing savings, and spent the next 5 years paying off their luxury party just to keep the peace. But I was no longer the frightened 22-year-old girl sitting on a porch with garbage bags. I was a corporate executive who dealt with hostile vendor negotiations and million-dollar property acquisitions before lunch. I did not raise my voice. I did not justify my life choices. I did not explain that I owned the logo stamped at the top of the page. Explanations are for people who need to be understood. I only needed to be clear. I took the heavy stock paper from my chest. I folded it precisely in half along the original crease. I folded it again into a neat, perfect square. I placed it gently onto the small glass side table next to Patricia. "I do not owe you a dime," I said. The words came out smooth and unhurried, carrying the quiet weight of absolute certainty. And I never did. Patricia's face flushed a deep, mottled red. The veins in her neck stood out against her pearl necklace. "You selfish little failure," she hissed, dropping the volume of her voice to a lethal register. "You will pay this, or I swear to you I will destroy whatever pathetic life you managed to scrape together. I will tell everyone in that ballroom exactly what kind of daughter you are." I smoothed the front of my navy dress. "You cannot destroy a house you do not have the keys to," I replied. I turned my back on them. I walked toward the heavy oak door. I did not rush. I did not look back at the mirror to gauge Jessica's reaction. I simply grasped the brass handle, pulled the door open, and stepped out into the quiet corridor, letting the door click firmly shut behind me. Inside that suite, Patricia felt victorious. She firmly believed she had won the interaction. She assumed my quiet exit meant I was retreating to cry in a bathroom stall, or calling my bank to desperately transfer funds, or resigning myself to the inevitable social execution she had planned. She was confident that the sheer terror of public humiliation would eventually force me to walk to the catering manager and swipe my credit card. She was entirely oblivious to how my business operated. Wilson Premium Hospitality maintained a flawless profit margin because we utilized a rigorous automated financial system. The software commanded the entire venue infrastructure. Our corporate protocol required a zero balance on all event ledgers before the main reception could commence. If a client carried a delinquent balance, the system did not issue polite reminders. It executed a hard stop. If the digital ledger showed an unpaid invoice at exactly 8 o'clock in the evening, the venue transitioned into lockdown mode. The automated lighting system would dim. The electronic locks on the premium liquor cabinets would engage. The kitchen staff would receive a direct notification on their monitors to halt all food production immediately. The bartenders would step away from their stations. It was a strict security measure designed specifically to prevent grifters from stealing thousands of dollars in luxury services. I stopped in the hallway and checked the face of my watch. The gold hands caught the glow of the wall sconces. It was currently 7:45. The digital clock in my company's main server room was quietly ticking forward, counting down the minutes until the automated system cut the power to Jessica's illusion. Patricia thought she had until the end of the night to force my hand. She actually had 15 minutes before the arithmetic took control of the room. I took a slow, deep breath of the cool hallway air. I adjusted my posture, ensuring my shoulders were squared and my expression remained neutral. The trap they had spent months setting for me was fully armed, but they had placed themselves directly over the snare. I needed to find Richard. The groom's father was waiting for me outside in the courtyard, holding the printed email thread that linked my name to the very company Patricia was currently trying to defraud. The isolated pieces of the puzzle were about to come together, and the resulting impact would shatter the wedding beyond repair. I walked down the corridor, leaving the scent of hairspray and panic far behind me. I walked down the long corridor, moving away from the suffocating scent of the bridal suite. The heavy oak doors leading to the courtyard stood at the end of the hall. I pushed them open and stepped into the crisp Massachusetts autumn. The cold air hit my face, carrying the sharp scent of crushed pine needles and damp earth. The string quartet playing inside the ballroom faded into a dull, rhythmic thrum behind the thick glass windows. Richard waited near a bubbling stone fountain. He did not pace. He did not fidget. Men who control real estate empires do not waste physical energy on nervous habits. He stood perfectly still, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned, the glow of his smartphone casting a pale blue light across his jawline. He heard my heels clicking against the flagstone patio, but did not immediately look up. He kept his focus locked on the screen in his palm. I stopped 3 feet away from him. The ambient light from the venue illuminated the sharp lines of his face. He looked like a man who had just discovered the foundation of a skyscraper was poured using sand instead of concrete. "My corporate team sent me this file 3 years ago," Richard said. His voice was low, carrying a rough texture I had not heard inside the ballroom. He turned the phone around so the screen faced me. It was an email thread. The header displayed the secure internal routing system of his conglomerate. The body of the message contained a finalized vendor contract for premium logistical services across his eastern seaboard properties. At the very bottom of the chain, stamped beneath a paragraph of strict confidentiality clauses, sat a digital signature block. Lynn Wilson, Chief Executive Officer, Wilson Premium Hospitality. "My corporate team has been dealing with you for 3 years, Richard stated, his eyes lifting from the glowing screen to meet mine. You are Lynn Wilson. You own the company holding the contract for this venue. I looked at the digital signature. Then I looked at the groom's father. I nodded once. Richard closed his eyes. He dragged a heavy, calloused hand down his face. The gesture stripped away his polished society demeanor, leaving behind an exhausted, bewildered father. A quiet, jagged exhale escaped his lungs. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. He leaned against the stone edge of the fountain. The water trickled quietly beside us, an innocent sound contrasting the sheer gravity of the moment. He looked back toward the ballroom windows. Through the glass, we could see the wedding guests mingling around the champagne tower. We could see Jessica spinning on the dance floor, her custom lace gown catching the chandelier light. She pitched me an investment, Richard said. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. 6 months ago, she asked David to arrange a private dinner with me at my club in Boston. She brought leather-bound portfolios. She brought printed spreadsheets. I stood very still. The autumn wind bit through the thin fabric of my navy dress, but I did not shiver. I listened. She told me she had built a sprawling hospitality startup from the ground up. Richard continued, his voice growing sharper, the initial shock morphing into a cold, focused fury. She recited growth metrics. She quoted a 91% client retention rate. She outlined a proprietary logistical software system that mapped venue inefficiencies in real time. She sat across from me eating an expensive steak and explained how she secured exclusive vendor contracts with the most elite historic estates in New England. My pulse settled into a slow, steady rhythm. The arithmetic clicked into perfect alignment. Jessica had not simply lied about being employed. She had stolen my entire corporate identity. She had memorized the exact metrics, the precise retention rates, and the specific operational models I had spent a decade building in the dark. She took the blueprint of my life and wore it like a tailored suit to impress a billionaire. I listened to her pitch. Richard set his hands clenching into fists at his sides. I looked at the numbers. They were flawless. The margins were spectacular. I thought my son had found an equal. I thought he was marrying a brilliant, self-made executive who understood the value of hard work. He turned his head to look directly at me. The realization crashed over his features, hardening his eyes into chips of gray flint. The numbers were flawless because they were yours, Richard whispered. Yes, I replied smoothly. The 91% retention rate belongs to my firm. The logistical software is my proprietary design. I built the portfolio she handed to you. Richard stared at the gold signet ring on my right hand. He finally understood why I wore it. It was the mark of a woman who signed the checks, not a woman who relied on tips to survive. I wrote her a check, Richard stated. The sentence hung in the freezing air, heavy and lethal. I wanted to provide seed capital for her planned expansion into the tri-state area. I framed it as a business investment, disguised as an early wedding gift. I wrote a check for $500,000. I did not gasp. I did not widen my eyes. I simply processed the data. $500,000. Jessica took a $500,000 investment from you to fund a company she does not own, I clarified, stripping all emotion from the summary. Richard nodded. The muscle in his jaw twitched. He was a man who destroyed rival corporations before breakfast. He ruined men who tried to skim fractions of a % off his profit margins. Now he was standing in a courtyard, forced to swallow the fact that a 24-year-old girl had conned him out of a fortune using stolen spreadsheets. She stole my money, Richard said, his tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. She stole your identity. She lied to my son. David believes he is marrying a successful founder. He thinks her wealth matches his. He has no idea he is tying his legal and financial future to a parasite. I looked through the glass doors. Patricia was hovering near the cake table, holding a fresh glass of wine, wearing a smug expression. My mother had just threatened to humiliate me in front of the groom's parents if I did not pay a $45,000 catering invoice. If Jessica received $500,000 from you 6 months ago, I said, leaning closer to Richard, Why did my mother just corner me in the bridal suite and demand I pay the venue bill to prevent the caterers from walking out? Richard froze. His sharp business instincts flared to life. The grief of a betrayed father vanished entirely, replaced by the calculating predator who built an empire. If she has my capital, Richard reasoned, matching my clinical tone, the wedding should be paid in full. There should be 0 delinquent balances. Unless she hid the funds, I replied. Unless she funneled your seed capital into private accounts and left the actual wedding expenses unpaid, assuming she could extort her estranged sister into covering the deficit at the 11th hour. We stood in the shadows, 2 executives recognizing a hostile threat. This was no longer a simple family dispute over a spoiled bride. This was a calculated, multi-layered financial crime. Jessica had orchestrated wire fraud. She had committed identity theft. She had manipulated a father's love for his son to extract wealth. And she planned to use my credit limit to fund the illusion. Richard turned his body fully toward me. The polite society charm he wore inside the ballroom was dead and buried. He looked at me not as a prospective relative, but as a tactical ally in a war zone. He knew I possessed the internal ledger. He knew I controlled the infrastructure of the very building we stood outside. "What time does your company shut down the catering if they do not pay?" Richard asked. I checked the face of my watch. The gold hands glinted in the moonlight. I looked back at the billionaire whose son was currently dancing with a felon. "We need to check the back-end ledger first," I said. "We need to see exactly where your money went." I pulled my phone from my clutch. The cold autumn air bit at my bare arms, but I barely felt it. I opened the encrypted application on my home screen and used my biometric login to bypass the security wall. The interface for Wilson Premium Hospitality loaded instantly, casting a sharp blue light over the stone fountain and Richard's grim expression. "Give me the exact name of the LLC she used to secure your investment," I said. My voice was level, matching the chill of the courtyard. I needed the specific data point to trace the missing funds. Richard did not hesitate. Vanguard Hospitality Group. I wired the funds directly to the business account she registered during her pitch. I typed the name into my search bar, cross-referencing it with the venue's master client database. The system ran a rapid query. Nothing appeared. I cleared the field and searched by her personal name instead. The event file for Jessica Wilson populated immediately. I tapped the screen to open the financial ledger and turned the device so Richard could see the descending rows of digital accounting. "Look at the initial deposit," I instructed, pointing to a line item dated 8 months prior. Richard narrowed his eyes, reading the fine print illuminated on the glass. "She paid a $50,000 deposit to secure the date. It says approved." "Look at the next column," I said softly. His gaze shifted to the right. A bright crimson indicator sat beside the transaction, glaring against the dark background. The text read, "Disputed chargeback. Funds reversed." Richard exhaled a slow, jagged breath, the white vapor curling into the night air. "She reversed the charge. She used a personal credit card to book the estate," I explained, tracing the timeline with my index finger. 3 days later, she contacted her bank and claimed the charge was fraudulent. The funds were forcefully pulled back from my corporate accounts. My software flags these disputes and grants a temporary grace period for the client to resolve the bank error. She exploited that grace period to keep the venue reservation active without paying a single dime of her own money. "And the remaining balance?" Richard asked, his voice tightening in his throat. $45,000, I replied. "Due in full before the reception doors open. That is the exact invoice your future in-laws just shoved against my chest in the bridal suite. They expected me to pay the staggering debt they accrued through credit fraud." Richard pulled his own phone from his pocket. Men who control global real estate portfolios do not wait until Monday morning to locate missing capital. They employ private wealth managers who answer on the first ring, even on a Saturday night. David Richard said the moment the line connected. His tone held no warmth, no pleasantries. "I need an immediate wire trace. Vanguard Hospitality Group. The $500,000 I sent 6 months ago. Find out exactly where it went and call me back." He hung up without saying goodbye. We stood in the shadows of the Berkshire estate, 2 executives, waiting for the arithmetic to confirm a crime. Through the thick glass doors, the wedding reception was in full swing. Waiters carried silver trays of vintage champagne. The jazz quartet played a lively tune. Jessica was spinning on the dance floor, dripping in diamonds, performing the role of the wealthy bride for an audience of 300 elite guests. My phone buzzed in my hand. A moment later, Richard's phone rang. He answered and put it on speaker. The wealth manager's voice was crisp and professional, echoing faintly against the stone walls of the courtyard. "Sir, the trace is complete. The Vanguard account was drained 48 hours after your wire cleared. The funds were dispersed into 3 separate offshore holding accounts in the Cayman Islands. We also show significant outbound transfers to luxury retail lines, high-end jewelers, and a private leasing company for exotic vehicles. Did a single dollar go toward vendor payments or corporate hospitality infrastructure?" Richard asked, his jaw locked tight. "No, sir. The account currently holds a balance of $42. It is a hollow shell entity." "Freeze everything connected to my network," Richard commanded. "Engage the fraud department. I want her locked out of every financial avenue before the hour is up." "Understood, sir." The line clicked dead. Richard slipped his phone back into his tuxedo jacket. He did not yell. He did not punch the stone fountain. His reaction was far more dangerous. The polished, high society patriarch vanished, replaced by the ruthless tactician who built a conglomerate by crushing anyone who tried to cheat him. His posture straightened. The lines around his mouth hardened into granite. His eyes turned the color of winter ice. "They think they can play my family," he whispered. His tone was lethal, carrying a promise of total ruin. "They think my son is a blank check for their grift." I looked at him. I did not offer pity. Pity is a useless emotion when facing a hostile threat. I offered a strategy. "Your son is about to sign a legally binding marriage certificate," I said smoothly. "If he signs those papers, her debts and her legal liabilities become his problem. You need to expose the fraud tonight before the ink dries on that document." Richard turned his gaze back to the ballroom. "If I walk in there and stop the wedding right now, she will play the victim. She will cry in her custom gown. She will claim it is a misunderstanding. She will tell David I am trying to control his life. My son loves her. He might believe her tears over my bank statements. She cannot play the victim if the trap she set for me snaps shut on her instead," I replied. Richard looked at me, a silent question forming in his sharp eyes. I checked the gold watch on my wrist. The hands glinted in the dim, ambient light. "It is currently 7:45, I stated. "I designed my corporate software to operate on a strict automated protocol to prevent industry theft. If a venue balance is not settled in full, the system executes a hard stop. It does not issue polite warnings. It locks the building down." Richard leaned closer, listening with predatory focus. "At exactly 8 o'clock, I continued. The automated system will shut off the power to the kitchen equipment. The electronic locks on the premium liquor cabinets will engage. The catering staff will receive a direct notification on their monitors to cease all service. The reception will end instantly." A slow, dark realization spread across Richard's face. He saw the architecture of the impending collapse. He understood the beauty of the mechanism. "Your mother and sister believe they have until the end of the night to force you to pay," he summarized. "Yes," I confirmed. "They think the threat of public humiliation will break my resolve. They expect me to quietly hand over my credit card to avoid a scene, just like I used to do when I was younger. They do not realize the arithmetic is already calculating their ruin." Richard adjusted his cuffs. The anger in his posture settled into a cold, focused readiness. We forged an unspoken alliance in that moment. We were two people who understood the power of letting a fraudster talk themselves into a corner. This was not about petty revenge. It was about surgically removing a financial parasite from his son's life and severing the toxic tether my family had tried to wrap around my neck for a decade. "We let them dig their own graves," Richard said, his voice dropping to a low, unforgiving register. "We let them perform their fake wealth in front of my entire network. And when the clock strikes 8, we let the venue humiliate them for us. They will panic, I warned him. Patricia will demand the staff keep pouring wine. Jessica will try to spin a lie. They will run out of options very quickly when the staff refuses to comply. Good, Richard replied. I want David to see exactly who he is marrying when the money runs out. We stood in the cold air for another minute, watching the guests inside laugh and drink on stolen time. The sheer arrogance of my mother handing me an invoice for a party she funded with a stolen $500,000 tasted like bitter copper. She had thrown me out of the house in Worcester because I refused to sign a bad loan. Now she was trying to force me to finance a felony. I smoothed the fabric of my navy dress. I felt no fear. I felt the profound, settling calm of a woman who knows the foundation beneath her enemies is built entirely on sand. Richard stepped away from the fountain and moved toward the heavy oak doors. He placed his hand on the brass handle, then paused and looked back at me over his shoulder. The light from the ballroom caught the sharp, unrelenting angle of his jaw. I am going to make a toast, Richard whispered. Be ready. The heavy oak doors swung shut, cutting off the crisp autumn wind and sealing us back inside the glittering illusion of the Berkshire estate. The transition from the freezing quiet courtyard into the stifling heat of the ballroom felt like stepping onto an entirely different planet. Heat radiated from 300 bodies, from the silver chafing dishes, from the sheer friction of so much expensive perfume and forced laughter blending together under the vaulted ceilings. The jazz quartet played a lively, upbeat tune in the corner, providing the perfect soundtrack for a room full of people who had no idea the floor was about to drop out from beneath them. The catering staff moved gracefully between the round tables, carrying heavy porcelain dinner plates and replacing them with fresh silverware. My staff. I watched them execute the precise maneuvers I had drilled into them during their initial training sessions. Clear from the right, serve from the left. Invisible, seamless perfection. They performed flawlessly, entirely unaware that their employer was standing in the shadows, waiting for an automated protocol to strip the venue bare. Richard walked half a step ahead of me. His posture had fundamentally shifted in the span of a 10-minute conversation. When he first escorted me outside, he carried the relaxed, polished demeanor of a wealthy patriarch hosting a joyful celebration. Now, his shoulders held a rigid, dangerous tension. The polite society father had vanished. The billionaire real estate titan had taken his place. He moved with lethal purpose, his eyes scanning the crowd, evaluating the sheer scale of the fraud unfolding in front of him. Patricia noticed us re-entering almost immediately. She stood near the towering ice sculpture, holding a fresh glass of white wine, her emerald green dress shimmering under the crystal chandeliers. My mother had spent her entire adult life chasing invitations to rooms exactly like this one. Growing up in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of Worcester, she worshipped the elite circles she read about in local society pages. She viewed high society as a private club she deserved to run. To her, this wedding was a coronation. She had finally purchased her way into the inner circle, even if she had used stolen capital and credit fraud to buy the ticket. She saw Richard walking near me, and her face brightened with a smug, triumphant satisfaction. She assumed the worst. In her mind, the wealthy patriarch had just pulled the embarrassing waitress daughter outside to deliver a harsh lecture about proper etiquette. She genuinely believed Richard had done her dirty work for her. She glided across the marble floor to intercept us, eager to capitalize on my supposed humiliation. She wanted the surrounding guests to witness her aligning herself with the billionaire against the family failure. "I hope my daughter has not been bothering you, Richard," Patricia announced. She projected her voice outward, ensuring the wealthy guests standing near the oyster bar caught every single syllable. She let out a practiced, airy laugh. "She is just a waitress. She truly does not understand how high society events operate. Please forgive her lack of refinement." Richard stopped walking. He did not offer a polite chuckle. He did not nod in agreement. He slowly turned his head to look at my mother. His expression held such profound, freezing contempt that Patricia actually took a half step backward. He looked at her the way a health inspector looks at a cockroach resting on a prep counter. "She understands a great deal more than you know," Richard replied. His tone held zero warmth. It was cold, sharp, and brutally final. He did not wait for Patricia to respond. He simply walked past her, leaving her standing frozen near the ice sculpture with her wine glass hovering near her chest. Deep, visible confusion washed over her features. The script she had written in her head had just caught fire, and she lacked the capacity to put it out. I did not linger to watch her panic set in. I navigated through the labyrinth of tables, heading toward the very back of the room. Table 42 sat tucked into the darkest corner, positioned near the swinging doors of the service kitchen. They had seated me with distant third cousins and random plus ones. It was the geographic equivalent of an insult, designed to keep me out of all the professional photographs. Tonight, it served as the perfect vantage point. I took my seat. A cousin I had not seen in a decade offered a tight smile, then quickly looked away. I reached into my purse and retrieved my phone. I placed it face up on the white linen tablecloth, right next to my water glass. The digital numbers glowed brightly against the dark screen. 7:52 in the evening. 8 minutes remained until the software executed the hard stop. Through the gaps in the crowd, I watched the dance floor. Jessica twirled under the changing lights, her custom lace gown flaring outward. She threw her head back and laughed at something David said. She wore a heavy diamond necklace that caught the chandelier glow, refracting bright prisms across the room. She looked like the perfect, carefree heiress. My sister had spent her entire life stealing credit for other people's labor. In high school, she routinely copied assignments and charmed teachers into giving her extensions. In her brief, failed attempts at holding corporate jobs, she survived by taking credit for the presentations her junior colleagues built. But tonight was her masterpiece. She was dancing in a ballroom paid for by her estranged sister, wearing jewelry funded by a stolen $500,000 investment, celebrating a marriage built entirely on wire fraud. And she felt no guilt. She only felt the thrill of the spotlight. David held her waist, smiling down at his new bride. He possessed a good heart and a trusting nature. He genuinely believed he had married a brilliant, self-made hospitality founder. He had no clue the woman in his arms had funneled his father's money into offshore accounts just days after the check cleared. 300 elite guests mingled around them. Senators, corporate lawyers, real estate developers. They clinked glasses and shared polite anecdotes. They were wholly unaware of the financial time bomb currently ticking beneath their expensive shoes. The caterers began emerging from the kitchen doors behind me, carrying silver trays loaded with dessert plates. They prepared for the final service push. They did not know the corporate servers were silently locking down their point-of-sale terminals and engaging the electronic security locks on the liquor cabinets. 7:55. I sat perfectly still. I did not touch my water. I watched the digital numbers change on my screen. A quiet thrill settled into my veins. For 10 years, I had swallowed every insult, every returned birthday card, every discarded attempt at connection. I had let them control the narrative. I had let them cast me as the failure. The era of my silence was ending, measuring itself in descending seconds. 7:57. Richard rose from his seat at the main family table. He adjusted his tuxedo jacket. His face held a grim, unyielding determination. He bypassed the head table where Patricia had just returned. She watched him walk past her, brow furrowed in mounting anxiety. She tried to catch his eye, but he ignored her entirely. 7:58. Richard reached the edge of the center stage where the jazz quartet played a soft melody. He stepped up onto the polished wood. He signaled the bandleader to stop playing. The music faded out, replaced by the murmurs of the confused crowd. Richard walked directly to the microphone stand. He picked up a crystal champagne flute from a nearby table. He pulled a silver pen from his pocket and tapped the glass. The sharp ringing sound echoed through the vast ballroom. The ambient chatter died down. 300 heads turned toward the stage. The waitstaff paused in their tracks. Jessica stopped dancing, turning toward her new father-in-law with a bright, expectant smile. She assumed he was about to deliver a heartwarming toast about her fake business acumen. I watched the clock on my phone flip to 7:59. The room fell dead silent. My phone rested flat against the white linen tablecloth. The digital screen burned bright against the dim shadows of table 42. 7:59. The digits glared back at me like a countdown on a detonator. Across the cavernous ballroom, Richard stepped onto the polished wooden stage. He moved with the heavy, undeniable certainty of a man who owned the ground beneath his feet. He did not carry notes. He did not look nervous. He pulled a silver spoon from his breast pocket and picked up a crystal champagne flute from a passing tray. He tapped the spoon against the crystal 3 times. The sharp, ringing chime cut straight through the low hum of 300 wealthy guests. The jazz quartet in the corner halted mid-measure. The sound of silverware scraping against porcelain faded into nothing. The ambient chatter of senators, corporate lawyers, and real estate developers died a sudden death. Every face in the room turned toward the groom's father. Jessica stood near the edge of the sprawling dance floor with her arm looped through David's elbow. She wore a smile of practiced humility. She tilted her chin downward, playing the role of the modest, brilliant bride. She expected a tribute. She anticipated a billionaire patriarch welcoming her into his elite dynasty with open arms and a generous check. Beside her, Patricia stood tall, smoothing the fabric of her emerald dress. My mother scanned the room, making sure the local socialites were paying attention. She wanted witnesses for her ultimate triumph. She was about to get them, just not for the triumph she envisioned. Richard leaned into the microphone. He did not smile. He looked out over the sea of tailored suits and designer gowns. "Tonight, we celebrate truth," Richard began. His voice echoed off the vaulted 19th century ceiling beams. It was a rich, commanding baritone. The voice of an executive who routinely restructured global portfolios before his morning coffee. "We gather here under the impression that we are celebrating a union of equals," Richard continued. "We were told this magnificent event was funded by my new daughter-in-law. We were told she is the founder of a highly successful hospitality empire, a brilliant entrepreneur who graciously paid for this reception with her own hard-earned wealth." The room erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. High society crowds love a self-made success story. Jessica beamed, soaking in the admiration. She leaned her head onto David's shoulder while her stolen diamond necklace fractured the chandelier light into tiny, glittering rainbows. Patricia clapped louder than anyone else, turning her head left and right to ensure the women at the adjacent table saw her glowing face. She looked unbearably smug. She looked like a woman who had successfully scammed her way into the highest echelon of power. Richard let the applause roll for several seconds. He allowed the lie to swell to its peak. He let them build their pedestal as high as it would go. Then he lowered the microphone slightly. His posture shifted. The warmth drained from his voice, replaced by the chilling precision of a corporate executioner. "But true success," Richard stated, his tone dropping a full octave, "belongs to the actual architect of tonight." The applause died an awkward, sudden death. The guests sensed the shift in barometric pressure. People shifted uncomfortably in their velvet chairs. David looked at his father, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. Jessica's smile remained frozen on her face, but her eyes darted nervously toward her mother. "I have spent my life building a real estate conglomerate," Richard said. The silence in the room was so profound, you could hear the air conditioning vents humming. "I know what real business looks like. I know the grit required to build an enterprise in the dark. So tonight, I would like to publicly thank the real CEO of Wilson Premium Hospitality, the woman whose company actually owns this historic venue, the woman who holds the exclusive vendor contracts for my entire Eastern Seaboard portfolio." Richard paused. He turned his head and looked directly at Patricia. He held her gaze from 50 feet away, pinning her in place. "And I would especially like to thank the woman whom my son's new family called a waitress just 10 minutes ago." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. 300 guests inhaled sharply. The insult hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. Patricia's face turned the color of old ash. Her jaw dropped. Her fingers went slack. The crystal wine glass slipped from her hand. It hit the marble floor with a sharp crack. Red wine splashed across the polished stone and stained the hem of her emerald dress, pooling around her shoes like a dark warning. She did not even look down. She stood, paralyzed. Richard raised his hand and pointed past the towering ice sculptures, past the sprawling floral arrangements, straight toward the dark corner near the kitchen doors. He pointed directly at table 42. "Stand up, Lynn Wilson," Richard commanded. The lighting technician, having received prior instructions from the groom's father, adjusted the main stage control. A bright white beam swept across the ceiling, cut through the darkness, and settled squarely on my table. 300 heads swiveled in unison, 600 eyes locked onto the woman sitting in the shadows. I looked past the blinding glare of the spotlight and focused on the dance floor. Jessica looked like she had stopped breathing. The color drained from her cheeks so fast she appeared translucent. Her knees buckled slightly, forcing David to catch her arm to keep her upright. She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing in silent panic. She finally understood. The hospitality empire she claimed to own belonged to the sister she threw away. The venue she stood inside belonged to the sister she mocked. The entire foundation of her fake life rested in the palm of my hand. I did not stand up. Standing requires seeking permission from the room. I did not need their permission. I sat perfectly still in my simple navy dress. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the stem of my sparkling water glass. I lifted it slowly into the bright beam of the spotlight. I looked directly at Patricia, then at Jessica, and I raised the glass in a silent, devastating toast. I did not smile. I offered a slow, deliberate nod. It was the gesture of an executive acknowledging the end of a hostile takeover. It was the physical manifestation of 10 years of erasure being handed back to the people who authored it. The illusion shattered instantly. The hushed whispers of the guests swelled into a frantic, buzzing roar. Senators and real estate developers leaned across their tables, pointing, whispering, recalculating everything they had been told. I lowered my glass and glanced at the glowing screen of my phone resting on the white linen. 8 o'clock. The digital clock ticked over, the automated corporate protocol engaged. I did not have to lift a single finger. The software governing the Berkshire estate executed its hard stop. Above us, the grand crystal chandeliers flickered, twice a pre-programmed warning signal before dimming by 70%. The ballroom plunged into a harsh, utilitarian emergency lighting scheme. The romantic golden glow vanished entirely, leaving the room looking cold and clinical. At the mahogany bars lining the perimeter, the bartenders simultaneously set down their silver shakers. They stepped back from the counters, folded their hands behind their backs, and moved away from the premium liquor. Small, polite signs reading "Closed" were placed on the marble surfaces. The heavy double doors leading to the service kitchen clicked audibly as the electronic security locks engaged. The wait staff, loyal employees who followed my strict vendor guidelines to the letter, stopped moving. Those carrying trays of expensive desserts simply turned around and walked back to the staging area. Those pouring water stopped mid-pour, placed the heavy glass pitchers on the side stations, and lined up against the perimeter walls. The flow of luxury ceased in the span of 10 seconds. The music was dead, the lights were stark, the wine stopped flowing. The hospitality they had stolen was abruptly revoked. Patricia and Jessica were left standing in the middle of a cold, quiet room, surrounded by 300 confused guests facing a $45,000 deficit they could not pay. The lockdown had officially begun. The music did not fade out. It died instantly. The final note of the saxophone clipped off mid-breath, leaving a hollow, echoing void that seemed to suck the warmth directly out of the grand ballroom. For a single second, 300 people remained frozen in their tracks, forks suspended halfway to their mouths, champagne flutes hovering in midair. Then the rhythmic, metallic sound of the bartenders stepping back from the long marble counters sliced through the quiet. They moved in perfect unison, their expressions blank, their hands dropping to their sides as they placed the clear acrylic signs onto the polished surfaces. The bold black lettering on the signs faced the crowd, delivering a silent public verdict. Closed. A low, anxious murmur rippled through the elite tables. High society New England crowds do not tolerate disruptions, especially not when they are dressed in tailored tuxedos and custom silk gowns. They looked at their empty water pitchers, then at the waitstaff, who had silently formed an unbreakable human wall along the perimeter of the room. My employees stood shoulder to shoulder, their postures rigid, their eyes fixed on the far wall, executing the strict corporate protocol for delinquent, unpaid events with chilling efficiency. They had been trained to handle financial defaults with the same cold professionalism as a bank asset seizure. My mother broke the paralysis first. Patricia did not look at the broken glass at her feet or the red wine ruining the hem of her emerald green dress. She saw her carefully curated world dissolving under the harsh utilitarian emergency lights, and her maternal facade shattered into sharp pieces. She spun on her heel, her silk skirts rustling loudly in the dead silent room, and rushed toward the service station where the head catering manager stood. Her skin was no longer pale. It was flushed a deep, frantic crimson that seeped up from her collarbone to her ears. She looked entirely unhinged, the thin veneer of high society politeness melted away by pure panic. She stopped inches from the manager, her chest heaving, her fingers clawing at the edge of his wooden podium. "What are you doing?" Patricia demanded, her voice piercing the quiet room, cracking under the strain of her rising pitch. "Pour the wine immediately. This is my daughter's wedding." The man standing before her was Lawrence. I had hired Lawrence 5 years ago when Wilson Premium Hospitality was just a small logistical firm operating out of a rented warehouse in Boston. He was the first manager I trusted with our back-end software systems, a loyal employee who understood that in the corporate hospitality world, arithmetic always triumphs sentiment. He did not blink at her rage. He did not adjust his posture or look away from her wild eyes. He remained as calm as a flatline, his voice low, steady, and devastatingly clear. "I am sorry, ma'am," Lawrence replied, his words carrying perfectly across the silent ballroom. "Corporate protocol. Your account is $45,000 in arrears. All services are suspended until the balance is settled in full." The word arrears landed on the high society tables like a block of concrete. The guests leaned closer to each other, their whispers turning into a sharp, judgmental hiss. In these social circles, an unpaid bill is far worse than a public shouting match. It is a social death sentence. Patricia felt the floor shifting beneath her feet. She realized the entire room was watching her crown jewel event turn into a vulgar vendor dispute. She did not look at Richard, who remained on the center stage with his arms crossed, watching her with freezing detachment. Instead, she focused all her frantic terror on the dark corner of the room. She focused on me. Patricia stormed away from the service station. She did not walk. She stomped across the marble floor, her high heels clicking like a ticking clock against the stone. She bypassed the head bridal party table, ignoring the terrified looks from the bridesmaids, and marched straight toward the very back of the room. 300 pairs of eyes followed her path, tracking her as she descended upon table 42. She reached the edge of my table and slammed both of her manicured hands onto the white linen tablecloth. The impact rattled my water glass, sending tiny ripples across the surface of the sparkling liquid. She leaned down until her face was inches from mine. The smell of sour champagne and expensive perfume radiated from her skin. The mask was completely gone now, leaving behind the raw, ugly desperation of a woman who had run out of people to manipulate. "Fix this right now," Patricia hissed, her voice vibrating with a sharp, uncontrollable panic that she could no longer hide from the surrounding guests. "You owe this family, Lynn. You will walk over to that manager, you will swipe your corporate card, and you will turn these lights back on before you ruin your sister's life." I did not flinch away from her. I did not raise my hands to defend myself or lower my eyes to match her dominance. I remained seated in my tailored navy dress, letting the silence between us stretch until her breathing became ragged. I reached down cheesecake beside my chair, opened the leather zipper of my work bag, and pulled out my navy blue binder. The thick metal rings gleamed under the harsh emergency lights as I placed the heavy folder flat on the linen tablecloth between us. I opened the binder. The heavy white pages turned slowly, the text crisp and clinical. I bypassed the returned Mother's Day cards, the logged phone records, and the transcription of her toxic birthday voicemail. I flipped straight to the final tab, the financial section, where my private auditors had spent the last 48 hours compiling the true cost of the Wilson family ledger. I extracted a single printed document from the plastic sleeve. I did not hand it to her. I slid the paper slowly across the white cloth until it rested directly beneath her trembling fingers. It was a comprehensive, verified financial ledger detailing 10 years of systematic theft, unpaid familial loans, and fraudulent chargebacks. Every single dollar Patricia and Jessica had extracted from my early savings was listed by date, time, and transaction code. But at the very bottom of the page, highlighted in a cold, bold font, sat the ultimate detonation block. It was the exact international routing numbers and wire transfer receipts tracking the $500,000 Richard had given Jessica 6 months ago. The document proved that the wealth was never invested in a hospitality startup. It proved the money had been immediately funneled into private, offshore holding accounts in the Cayman Islands to service Jessica's astronomical personal luxury debts, leaving the actual wedding venue completely unpaid. I looked up into my mother's wild, sweat-streaked face. I spoke with surgical precision, my tone dropping to a level that was calmer than the room could stand. I do not owe you anything. I said each word separating from the next like a scalpel cut. I never did. But you owe him. Patricia opened her mouth to scream, to deploy another theatrical cry for sympathy, but the words died in her throat as a shadow fell over our table. David had followed her from the front of the room. The groom stood in his custom tuxedo, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a confusion that was rapidly morphing into terror. He had heard my final sentence. He looked down at the table, his gaze locking onto the printed ledger resting beneath his mother-in-law's hands. David was not a fool. He was an executive financial consultant who managed commercial portfolios for his father's real estate firm. He knew exactly what a wire transfer confirmation looked like. He recognized the geometric corporate stamp of his father's primary bank. His eyes tracked across the page, reading the offshore routing numbers, calculating the rapid 48-hour liquidation of the $500,000 check his father had written as a sacred family investment. He read the ledger once. He read it twice. The silence at table 42 became absolute. David looked up from the paper, his head turning slowly toward the dance floor, where Jessica was still standing in her custom lace bridal gown, her hands trembling as she clutched her stolen diamonds. He did not see his beautiful, successful entrepreneur bride anymore. The illusion had been stripped away by a single sheet of paper, exposing the cold, calculating face of a financial predator who had targeted his father's network. He finally saw his bride's true, terrifying face, and the realization broke the last remaining timber of the Wilson family lie. David stood frozen over the white linen tablecloth. His eyes darted across the printed rows of black ink on the ledger I had provided. He was not merely a wealthy heir resting on a trust fund. David operated as a senior financial consultant for his father's empire. He spent his weekdays auditing commercial portfolios and tracking liquidity across international borders. He understood money. He knew how it moved, how it hid, and how it left an undeniable trail. He traced his index finger down the right side of the page. He saw the Vanguard Hospitality Group LLC heading. He saw the initial $500,000 deposit from his father. Then his finger tracked the rapid sequence of outbound wire transfers, offshore holding accounts in the Caymans, high-end jewelers, luxury car leases, all executed within 48 hours of Richard writing the check. David looked up. He stared at the woman he had pledged to marry. Jessica stood a few feet away, trembling inside her custom lace gown. The imported fabric suddenly looked like a very expensive costume on a very cheap actress. "You told me you used my father's money to pay the vendors," David said. His voice lacked any heat. It was eerily quiet, carrying the flat, hollow tone of a man watching his future evaporate in real time. "You sat in my office and told me your company generated $2 million last quarter." Jessica shrank back. The harsh emergency lighting cast deep shadows across her face. For years, she had relied on charm and unearned confidence to glide through life. She possessed an uncanny ability to mirror whatever the person in front of her desired. David valued hard work and ambition, so Jessica had mirrored my life. She wore my corporate success like a stolen winter coat. Now the coat was stripped away, leaving her shivering in the cold reality of her own choices. She defaulted to her favorite defense mechanism. She tried to play the victim. Tears welled in her eyes. Not genuine tears of regret, but calculated, desperate drops designed to solicit sympathy from a wealthy man. Her lower lip quivered. She reached out with shaking hands, playing the role of the innocent, besieged bride. "David, please," Jessica pleaded, her voice pitching into a fragile high frequency. "She is lying. Lynn is just jealous of us. She has always been jealous of me. She hacked the documents to ruin my wedding." Patricia immediately flanked her golden child. My mother placed a protective arm around Jessica's shoulders, glaring at me with unfiltered venom. She treated the printed wire trace as if it were a minor social faux pas, rather than documented evidence of a felony. "This is a sick prank," Patricia hissed, turning her frantic attention to the groom. "Lynn is a bitter, broken woman. She hacked into some database to print these lies. Do not listen to her, David. She is just trying to steal your attention." David did not respond to my mother. He turned his head and looked directly at me. I did not rush to defend my paperwork. I did not raise my voice to shout over their frantic accusations. I remained seated in my chair at table 42, my hands resting lightly on my lap. I offered no desperate pleas for him to believe me. Truth does not need a megaphone. It sits quietly and waits for the lie to run out of breath. I looked back into David's eyes, projecting nothing but steady, clinical reality. He saw it. He looked at my simple navy dress devoid of flashy labels. He looked at the calm certainty in my posture. Then he looked back at the sobbing bride dripping in stolen diamonds. The contrast was impossible to ignore. A woman who builds an empire does not need to scream to prove her worth. A woman who steals one will scream until she loses her voice. "The CEO of my father's most trusted corporate partner did not hack anything," David stated. His voice cracked, betraying the profound betrayal slicing through his chest. "She did not forge a wire trace from my own family's bank." Jessica took a step forward, reaching out to touch his tuxedo lapel. "David, I love you. The money does not matter. We can fix this together." He recoiled from her touch as if she had handed him a live wire. He took a long, deliberate step backward, severing the physical distance between them. "You stole her life," David said, his words falling like heavy stones onto the marble floor. "You memorized her spreadsheets. You stole my father's money. You stole me." The gravity of those 4 sentences settled over the back of the room. The surrounding guests, senators, and socialites who had paid thousands of dollars for their own tailored outfits leaned in closer. The whispers began. The high society crowd despises vulgarity, and they were currently witnessing a masterclass in financial parasitism. They looked at Jessica with open disgust. Patricia realized the social capital she worshipped was slipping through her fingers. The elite network she had sacrificed me to infiltrate was now judging her. Panic overrode her minimal remaining sense of decorum. She decided to defend the indefensible, relying on the toxic worldview she had cultivated in our Worcester kitchen for a decade. "It is family money," Patricia shouted, her voice echoing across the silent ballroom. The sheer arrogance of this statement hung in the freezing air. "It does not matter whose name is on the company." My mother continued gesturing wildly toward me while shielding Jessica. "Lynn is blood. Whatever she builds belongs to this family." Jessica needed the capital for her wedding. We shared the resources. That is what families do. A collective gasp rippled through the nearby tables. Several women covered their mouths in genuine shock. A prominent real estate developer, sitting 2 tables away, shook his head in disgust. The logic was so twisted, so profoundly arrogant, that the wealthy attendees could not process it. In their world, stealing $500,000 from a prospective father-in-law was not sharing resources. It was a severe financial crime. Patricia had just confessed to the theft in front of 300 witnesses. She was so blinded by her own entitlement, so convinced that my labor existed solely to fund Jessica's comfort, that she did not realize she had just handed the prosecution a recorded motive. I watched my mother double down on the delusion that destroyed our relationship. She honestly believed that generating wealth stripped me of my autonomy. She thought my corporate bank accounts were communal property, ready to be plundered whenever her favorite daughter desired a new toy. She viewed my success not as an achievement to be celebrated, but as a resource to be harvested. David stared at his future mother-in-law with wide, horrified eyes. The color drained from his cheeks. He realized he was not just breaking off an engagement to a liar. He was escaping an entire cartel of grifters. He looked at Jessica, seeing the exact replica of Patricia standing before him. He saw the future he had narrowly avoided. The crowd parted near the center aisle. Heavy, measured footsteps approached our secluded corner. Richard stepped into the circle of dim emergency light. The billionaire patriarch had left the main stage and crossed the room, parting the sea of whispered gossip with his sheer presence. He did not come alone. Beside him walked a tall, severe-looking man holding a dark leather briefcase. I recognized the type immediately from my own corporate dealings. He was not a party guest. He wore a charcoal conservative suit and possessed the sharp, scanning gaze of a man accustomed to dismantling hostile adversaries in federal court. Richard had summoned his personal litigator. The jazz band remained silent. The catering staff held their positions against the wall, watching the climax unfold. The entire Berkshire estate held its breath, waiting for the final verdict to drop. Richard stopped next to his son, placed a firm hand on David's shoulder to steady him, and turned his icy gaze toward Patricia and Jessica. He was ready to utter the words that would seal their fate. Richard stepped into the dim light of table 42. The silver-haired patriarch did not look like a man attending a celebration anymore. He looked like a predator cornering a thief. Beside him stood his personal litigator, a man whose charcoal suit and rigid posture radiated legal danger. The jazz band remained silent across the room. The catering staff held their positions against the perimeter walls. 300 elite guests held their collective breath, straining to hear every word of the reckoning unfolding in the shadows. My mother attempted to deploy her charm one last time. She plastered a fragile, shaking smile across her face and took a step toward the billionaire. "Richard, please," Patricia stammered, her voice pitched high with raw terror. "This is just a simple misunderstanding between relatives. We can clear this up privately." "It matters to the IRS, and it matters to the police," Richard said. His voice cut through her panic like a sharpened blade. He did not raise his volume. He spoke with the chilling, measured cadence of a corporate titan executing a hostile takeover. Fraud is not a family dispute. It is a felony. Patricia shrank back as if she had been physically struck. The blood drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin an unhealthy shade of gray. She looked at the attorney standing next to Richard, realizing her twisted logic held zero world. Richard turned his sharp gaze away from my mother and looked toward the service station. He locked eyes with Lawrence, my head catering manager, who had been watching the confrontation unfold with professional detachment. "Bring them the machine," Richard commanded. Lawrence offered a crisp nod. He reached beneath the wooden podium and retrieved the wireless credit card terminal. The device was standard issue for Wilson Premium Hospitality, programmed to process large vendor transactions on the spot. Lawrence walked the device over to our table. His footsteps echoed in the silent room. He placed the heavy black terminal directly on the white linen tablecloth, right next to the printed ledger I had exposed minutes earlier. The digital screen glowed bright blue in the stark emergency lighting. Lawrence tapped the keypad a few times, entering the delinquent balance. He spun the terminal around so it faced Patricia. The glaring numbers illuminated the dark corner. $45,000. Pay the woman you called a failure, Richard stated. He pointed a steady, unforgiving finger at the glowing screen. You claimed you funded this extravagant reception. You told my entire network you were wealthy enough to host this event. Swipe your card right now. Patricia stared at the machine like it was a live explosive. Her chest heaved with shallow, erratic breaths. She looked around the room, searching for an exit, searching for a friendly face, searching for anyone who might intervene. She found nothing but stern, judgmental stares from the socialites she had spent her life trying to impress. The local politicians and real estate developers watched her squirm with open disdain. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she reached into her designer clutch. She fumbled with the clasp, her polished fingernails scraping against the leather. She produced a heavy platinum credit card, the tier she always flaunted at country club luncheons, to prove her status. Her fingers trembled so severely she almost dropped the plastic onto the floor. She grasped the card and slid it through the magnetic reader. The terminal hummed for 2 agonizing seconds. Processing, authorizing. Then a harsh electronic beep pierced the quiet. The screen flashed a bright red error message. Declined. Patricia gasped. A nervous sweat broke out across her forehead, ruining her expensive makeup. No, that is impossible, she whispered frantically. That account has a high limit. There must be a glitch with your system. She dug back into her purse and yanked out a second card. A premium travel rewards card. She shoved it into the chip reader, her breathing growing ragged. She stared at the screen, silently pleading for the transaction to clear, praying she could buy her way out of this humiliation. The machine hummed again. Beep. Declined. Jessica pushed past her mother, her custom lace bridal gown rustling loudly. The bride was crying now, realizing her perfect illusion was collapsing in front of her new husband. Let me try, Jessica sobbed, pulling a gold card from her own small bridal clutch. I have funds. I can cover it. Jessica jammed her card into the terminal. She held her breath, tears spilling down her cheeks and dripping onto her expensive imported lace. The terminal processed the request. Beep. Declined. The 3 women stood frozen around the table, staring at the relentless red text on the small screen. They had run out of plastic. They had run out of lies. They had run out of time. Richard watched their frantic, pathetic performance with unyielding coldness. He did not offer a shred of sympathy. He buttoned his tuxedo jacket and delivered the final crushing blow to their financial facade. Did you honestly believe I would wait until Monday morning to secure my stolen capital? Richard asked. His tone carried a lethal, freezing certainty. The moment my wealth manager confirmed the wire trace, I authorized a total lockdown. My legal team contacted the Federal Fraud Division 15 minutes ago. Your banking institutions received an emergency freeze order linked to the stolen $500,000. Every single account connected to your names is locked. Your credit lines are severed. Your checking accounts are frozen pending a criminal investigation. Patricia swayed on her feet. She grabbed the edge of the table to keep from collapsing onto the marble floor. Her platinum cards, the very foundation of her arrogant identity, were now useless pieces of plastic. She was entirely broke, standing in a venue she could not afford, surrounded by a crowd she could no longer deceive. David stood a few feet away, watching his bride sob over a declined credit card. He shook his head slowly, a gesture of profound revulsion. He turned his back on Jessica and walked over to stand beside his father, physically severing the tie between them. He wanted nothing more to do with the grifter who had tried to steal his family wealth. With no options left and her social standing annihilated, Patricia abandoned her pride. The smug, controlling matriarch vanished. In her place stood a desperate, terrified woman who suddenly realized she had thrown away her only lifeline a decade ago. She turned her tear-streaked face toward me. She dropped to her knees right there on the hard stone floor, ignoring the wine stains soaking into her emerald dress. She reached out, trying to grab my hand, but I pulled it away before her fingers could make contact. "Please, Lynn Patricia," begged her voice a wet, pathetic wail. "Please do not do this to us. Do not humiliate us like this. Tell the manager to turn the lights back on. Tell Richard to stop the lawyers. We are your blood. We are your family. You cannot send your own mother to prison." I looked down at the woman kneeling before me. I looked at the declined credit cards scattered across the white linen. I thought about the cramped kitchen in Worcester. I thought about my college textbooks sitting in garbage bags near the front door. I thought about the bitter, freezing wind hitting my face the night she locked me out because I refused to sign a predatory loan for a boutique that was destined to fail. I thought about the 10 years of returned birthday cards and the toxic voicemails calling me a worthless failure. She had discarded me without a second thought when I refused to be a blank check for her delusions. Now she wanted mercy from the very daughter she had spent a decade trying to erase. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to make the truth resonate through the silent ballroom. "Blood is just genetics," I said coldly, delivering the words with surgical precision. "It is an accident of biology. It does not earn you a free pass to commit fraud, and it certainly does not earn you my protection." Patricia sobbed harder, burying her face in her hands. Jessica slumped against the wall, sliding down until she sat on the floor in a heap of ruined white fabric. Accountability is a choice. I continued my gaze sweeping over my mother and my sister. You chose to steal. You chose to lie. You chose to build a magnificent stage on my dime, hoping you could extort me into paying for the production. Well, the production is over. The caterers are gone, the funds are frozen, and now the curtain is closing. I reached across the table and picked up my navy blue binder, securing the metal rings and sliding it safely back into my work bag. I picked up my glass of sparkling water, took one final refreshing sip, and set it down next to the glowing credit card terminal. The machine beeped one more time, a stark reminder of their financial ruin, before its screen went dark to conserve battery power. The legal trap Patricia and Jessica had walked into was flawless, but the night was far from finished. The financial devastation was only the first layer of their reckoning. As they sat weeping on the floor of the Berkshire estate, the deepest and darkest family secret of all was about to be unearthed from the grave. A heavy, rhythmic tapping sound echoed from the far end of the ballroom, cutting through the quiet aftermath. Someone was walking toward our table. Someone who had watched the entire toxic dynamic poison his daughter for decades. And he was carrying a sealed legal envelope that would evict Patricia from the last remaining piece of her fake high society life. The heavy, rhythmic tapping sound echoed from the far end of the ballroom, cutting through the quiet aftermath of the declined credit cards. Tap, pause, tap. The sound was sharp against the polished marble floor. The crowd of elite guests, still reeling from the financial devastation they had just witnessed, parted like water to let the source of the noise through. An elderly man stepped into the dim emergency lighting. He leaned heavily on a carved wooden cane. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that hung slightly loose on his aging frame. His silver hair was combed back neatly, and his face bore the deep, weathered lines of a man who had lived through 8 decades of hard truths. It was Grandpa William, my mother's father. William was the patriarch of Patricia's side of the family. He was a quiet, observant man who had built a lucrative regional hardware enterprise from a single storefront in the 1970s. He sold the business years ago and retired to the sprawling historic estate on the edge of Worcester, the same estate my mother currently occupied and used to project her fake high society status. Patricia turned toward the sound of the cane. Her tear-streaked face morphed from raw panic into profound confusion. She had not invited her own father to this wedding. She claimed his health was too fragile for a large reception. The reality was that William refused to fund Jessica's endless demands, so Patricia had conveniently excluded him from the guest list. Dad Patricia gasped, taking a stumbling step toward him. Her voice shook with fresh desperation. "What are you doing here? You should be resting at the house. Your heart cannot take this kind of stress." William did not reach out to embrace his daughter. He stopped 3 feet away from her, planting his cane firmly against the marble tile. He stood as tall as his fragile spine would allow. His eyes were not clouded with age or confusion. They were sharp, unyielding, and burning with a cold, focused fury. "I saw this coming," William rasped. His voice carried the rough, grating texture of crushed gravel, commanding the silent room with effortless authority. "I saw this disaster building for a decade." Patricia flinched. She tried to grab his forearm, attempting to guide him away from the center of the conflict. "Dad, please. You do not understand what is happening here. Lynn is trying to ruin us. She is trying to destroy your granddaughter's wedding." William struck his cane against the floor. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot, forcing Patricia to drop her hand and step back. "Do not lie to me," Patricia, William commanded. "Do not insult my intelligence by playing the victim. I sat at your kitchen table for years. I watched you throw Lynn away. I watched you treat a brilliant, hardworking girl like a burden while you worshipped a hollow lie." The ballroom remained dead silent. 300 guests hung on his every word. Richard stood nearby with his arms crossed, watching the elderly patriarch deliver the ultimate verdict. David stared at the floor, disgusted by the family he had almost married into. Jessica remained slumped in her ruined lace gown, too terrified to speak. I stayed quiet in my chair at table 42. I did not expect to see my grandfather tonight. He was the only relative who used to slip me $20 bills for textbooks when Patricia refused to pay for my school supplies. He was the only person who remembered my birthday after they locked me out. I thought he had simply stayed away to avoid the toxic drama. I had no idea he had spent the last 5 years building a fortress to protect me. "You spoiled Jessica until she became a parasite." William continued his sharp gaze, locking onto his weeping daughter. "You funded her delusions. You funded her arrogance. You taught her that the rules do not apply to her. And when Lynn refused to finance your terrible choices, you threw her out onto the freezing street. You told everyone she was a failure." "Dad, stop it," Patricia sobbed, wrapping her arms around her own torso. "People are listening. You are humiliating our family." "You humiliated yourself," William replied smoothly. "You built your entire life on a foundation of stolen credit and borrowed wealth, and you thought I was too blind to notice?" William shifted his weight onto his cane. He reached his free hand inside his charcoal suit jacket. 5 years ago, William said, addressing the room but keeping his eyes pinned on Patricia, "I contracted a severe case of pneumonia. I spent 2 weeks in the intensive care unit. The doctors told the family my prognosis was grim. I remembered that month. I had tried to visit him at the hospital, but Patricia had barred me from the intensive care wing, claiming my presence would agitate him. I had to bribe a sympathetic night nurse just to deliver a handwritten get well card." "Do you remember what you did while I was struggling to breathe?" Patricia, William asked. His tone dropped to a lethal, freezing register. Patricia went completely pale. The last remaining drops of blood drained from her face. She shook her head frantically, a silent plea for him to keep the secret buried. William ignored her panic. "You came into my hospital room with a clipboard," he stated. "You brought a quitclaim deed. You told me the medical bills were going to bankrupt the family. You told me I needed to sign the generational estate, the house you currently live in, directly over to Jessica to protect the assets from probate." A murmur of sheer disgust rippled through the elite crowd. The local politicians and real estate developers stared at Patricia with open revulsion. Attempting to force a dying man to sign away his home was a new level of depravity. "You thought I was too heavily medicated to read the fine print," William continued. "You thought I was too old and too weak to understand your greed. You wanted to secure the property for your golden child before my heart gave out." Patricia covered her face with her hands. She let out a pathetic, broken whimper. "But I did not die," William stated, his voice ringing with undeniable triumph. "I recovered, and the very first phone call I made when I was discharged was to a private estate attorney." William pulled a thick, sealed legal envelope from his breast pocket. He did not hand it to Patricia. He did not offer it to Jessica. He turned away from the women who had tried to steal his legacy and walked the remaining few steps toward my table. He stopped in front of me. He offered a small, proud smile, the kind of smile a general gives to a soldier who survived a brutal campaign. "I did not sign the estate to Jessica," William said. "I established an irrevocable trust. I placed the entire property, the land, the house, and the remaining liquid assets directly into that secure legal structure." He held the heavy envelope out toward me. I reached across the white linen tablecloth and took it from his trembling fingers. The paper felt solid, carrying the profound weight of a grandfather's enduring love. "I named you as the sole trustee and the sole beneficiary," William announced. His words carried perfectly across the dead, silent room. Patricia screamed. It was a guttural, primal sound of total defeat. Her knees buckled under the weight of the revelation. She grabbed the edge of the nearest chair to keep from collapsing onto the marble floor. The house she lived in, the sprawling estate she used to host her elite women's circle luncheons, the property she flaunted to prove her status to the neighborhood, did not belong to her. It had never belonged to her. For 5 years, the very foundation of her fake high society life had been legally controlled by the daughter she had just publicly disowned. "You live in Lynn's house," William told his daughter, delivering the final crushing blow without a shred of hesitation. "You sleep under her roof. You are nothing more than a tenant in her property, and she has every legal right to terminate your occupancy." I looked down at the sealed envelope in my hands. The wax stamp on the back bore the geometric logo of a prestigious Boston law firm. I slid my fingernail under the flap and broke the seal. I pulled out a stack of crisp, heavy stock documents. The legal architecture was flawless. It was a recorded trust deed, stamped and verified by the county clerk 5 years prior. The language was clinical and undeniable. The property was shielded behind a granite wall of legal protection. No amount of whining, no theatrical tears, and no forged quitclaim deeds could ever breach it. William had stripped Patricia of her ultimate safety net and handed the keys directly to me. I read the specific clauses outlining my absolute authority over the estate. The trust granted me the immediate power to evict any current occupants, liquidate the assets, or sell the land at my sole discretion. Patricia had spent the entire evening demanding that I pay her a $45,000 catering invoice to prove my worth to the family. She had threatened to destroy my life. Now the arithmetic proved she was entirely at my mercy. I placed the trust documents flat on the table, right next to the declined credit card terminal and the printed ledger detailing Jessica's wire fraud. 3 pieces of paper had systematically dismantled a decade of lies. Patricia stared at the documents from across the room. Her chest heaved with ragged, uncontrollable breaths. She looked at Richard, who was dialing his phone to summon the local authorities. She looked at David, who had already removed his boutonniere and was walking away from the dance floor. She looked at Jessica, who was sitting in a puddle of expensive lace, facing a federal criminal investigation. They had absolutely nothing left to leverage. The stage they had built to orchestrate my humiliation had become the site of their own total ruin. The financial trap had crushed them, the social exile was permanent, and the legal ambush had stripped away their home. I sat perfectly still, radiating the quiet, devastating authority of an executive who held all the cards. I placed my hands over the trust documents, feeling the solid reality of my grandfather's protection. The dinner was over, the performance was finished. It was time for me to deliver the final terms and walk away from this toxic lineage forever. I stood up. I did not rush the motion. I did not scrape my chair back against the marble or use my hands to brace my weight. I rose with the slow, steady rhythm of a woman who had spent a decade building a foundation that nobody in this room could ever shake. I looked at the faces surrounding table 42. 300 wealthy guests, the elite tier of Massachusetts real estate and corporate law, sat frozen in the harsh emergency lighting. They were watching me. For 10 years, my mother had ensured I was invisible. Tonight, she had placed me directly in the center of the stage, and I was about to deliver the final act. I did not scream. Anger requires an investment I was no longer willing to make. I did not gloat. Gloating is for people who are surprised by their own success. I simply projected the quiet, devastating authority of an executive who had finally reclaimed her space. "For 10 years, you told everyone I was a broken failure," I said. My voice echoed perfectly across the dead, silent ballroom, carrying the weight of 1,000 ignored phone calls and 100 returned birthday cards. "You used my name as a punchline. You used my sister as a weapon. You built an entire mythology around my supposed incompetence just to avoid looking at your own reflection." I turned my gaze downward. Jessica was still slumped on the floor, her custom imported lace dress bunching around her knees like discarded wrapping paper. The shimmering diamonds around her neck looked heavy, burdensome, like a chain she had locked around her own throat. She was sobbing. Great heaving breaths shook her shoulders, ruining her pristine bridal makeup. The illusion of the wealthy, brilliant hospitality founder had dissolved, leaving behind a terrified 24-year-old girl who had finally run out of lies to tell. "You stole $500,000, Jessica," I stated. The number hung in the cold air, stark and undeniable. "You forged business records. You funneled seed capital into offshore accounts. You bought designer clothes and leased exotic cars using money intended for a corporate expansion." She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing the palms of her hands against her ears, as if she could physically block the sound of her own ledger being read aloud. "You built a marriage on a felony," I continued, my tone clinical and detached. "You looked a trusting man in the eye and convinced him to tie his legal and financial future to a parasite. You thought you could use my business blueprint to fund your pretending, but arithmetic always demands a balance. Your account is overdrawn." David stood 3 feet away from his former bride. He did not reach down to comfort her. He did not offer a handkerchief. He looked at Jessica with a profound, chilling revulsion. He took a slow step backward, creating a physical boundary between his pristine family legacy and the criminal liability sobbing on the floor. Richard, standing tall beside his son, had already pulled his phone from his tuxedo jacket. His thumb tapped the screen, dialing the authorities. The local police precinct was only 2 miles down the road. The response time would be swift. I shifted my focus away from the ruined bride. I looked at the woman who had engineered this entire disaster. Patricia stood rigid near the empty chair. The emerald green silk of her dress looked dull under the utilitarian lighting. The red wine stain at her hem had dried into a dark, ugly shadow. She stared at the irrevocable trust documents resting on the white linen tablecloth. She looked at the signature of her own father, the patriarch, who had seen through her manipulation and quietly severed her safety net. "And you, Mom," I said. The word tasted hollow. It carried no warmth, no nostalgic affection. It was just a biological fact. You threw me away because I would not fund your delusions. You locked me out in the freezing winter wind because I refused to sign a predatory loan. You told me I was not part of this family unless I handed over my credit score to subsidize your golden child. Patricia opened her mouth. Her lips trembled. A single tear slipped down her cheek, cutting a jagged path through her foundation. She wanted to formulate a defense. She wanted to deploy a guilt trip to leverage the heavy, suffocating obligation of bloodlines. But she had no leverage left. She had played every card in her deck, and the table had collected them all. "Now you live in my house," I stated cleanly. The reality of the sentence struck her with physical force. Her knees buckled slightly. She grabbed the edge of the table to keep herself upright. The sprawling Worcester estate, the properties she flaunted at her high society luncheons, the foundation of her entire social identity, belonged entirely to the daughter she had mocked. She was nothing more than a tenant occupying a space I legally controlled. "You owe my company $45,000. I continued, pointing a steady finger toward the declined credit card terminal resting near my water glass. "You booked a venue you could not afford. You ordered premium wine and imported lobster on stolen credit. You attempted to extort me in the bridal suite, confident that the fear of public embarrassment would force me to swipe my card. You built a magnificent stage on my dime." I picked up the thick stack of trust documents. The heavy paper felt solid, grounding, real. I squared the edges with meticulous care. I set the documents back down on the table, positioning them right next to my half-empty glass of sparkling water. It was the same glass I had raised in a silent toast just 20 minutes ago, the exact moment the automated lockdown sequence began. "I will be evicting you on Monday," I announced. A gasp rippled through the nearby tables. Several wealthy guests shifted in their chairs, their eyes wide with shock. Evicting your own mother is a taboo concept in polite society, a harsh boundary that makes comfortable people squirm. But these guests did not know about the garbage bags on the porch. They did not know about the 10 years of deliberate erasure. They were only witnessing the inevitable consequence of a mother treating her child like a disposable asset. Patricia let out a ragged, pathetic whimper. "Lynn, please, where will I go? I have nothing." I looked into her green eyes. I saw the pure, unfiltered desperation of a woman who had finally met a boundary she could not manipulate, guilt trip, or cry her way out of. She was staring at a brick wall. "You will figure something out," I replied, echoing the exact words she had spoken to me when I was 12 years old, asking about a college savings account. "You are good at adapting." I turned to Grandpa William. The elderly patriarch stood leaning on his carved wooden cane. He looked exhausted, his silver hair catching the dim light, but his eyes were bright with a fierce, enduring pride. He offered me a slow, solemn nod. It was the nod of a general, recognizing a soldier who had just secured the perimeter. He knew I would protect the estate. He knew I would honor the legacy he had built. He had placed his trust in the right hands. "This dinner is over," I said. I reached down and picked up my purse from the empty chair beside me. The leather strap settled comfortably over my shoulder. I smoothed the front of my tailored navy dress, erasing a faint wrinkle near the hem. I did not check my makeup. I did not look around the room to gauge the audience's reaction. The audience did not matter anymore. Their opinions, their whispers, their high society judgments held zero currency in my life. I turned my back on my mother. I turned my back on my sister. I turned my back on the toxic lineage that had spent a decade trying to convince me I was small. I began walking toward the heavy oak doors at the front of the ballroom. My heels clicked against the polished marble floor, a steady rhythmic metronome marking the end of an era. The catering staff, my loyal employees, who had executed the lockdown protocol with flawless precision, parted to let me through. Lawrence, the head catering manager, offered a subtle, respectful dip of his chin as I passed his station. I returned the gesture. The wealthy guests moved aside, clearing a wide path down the center aisle. No one attempted to stop me. No one offered a patronizing comment or a plea for family reconciliation. They simply watched the true CEO of Wilson Premium Hospitality exit her own building. I pushed the heavy brass handle. The oak doors swung open, granting me passage into the grand foyer. The air out here smelled different. It lacked the suffocating scent of aerosol hairspray, spilled wine, and manufactured panic. It smelled like polished stone and quiet success. Behind me, muffled by the thick wood, I heard the heavy thud of the main ballroom doors swinging shut. The sound severed the last remaining tether. I walked across the foyer, my steps echoing in the vast, empty space. I thought about the cramped kitchen in Worcester. I thought about the long double shifts I had worked carrying cheap coffee pots and clearing dirty plates. I thought about the invisible empire I had built in the dark, laying every brick with my own hands, while my family laughed at my supposed failure. As I approached the main entrance, the faint, high-pitched wail of police sirens drifted through the crisp autumn night. Richard had not wasted a single second. The sound grew louder, cutting through the darkness, rushing toward the Berkshire estate to collect the fraudulent bride and sort through the wreckage of the stolen $500,000. I pushed through the exterior glass doors and stepped out into the freezing Massachusetts air. The cold wind hit my face sharp and reviving. I walked across the paved lot toward the discreet parking space reserved for the property owner. I unlocked my car, slid into the driver's seat, and rested my hands on the leather steering wheel. The engine purred to life, a low, steady hum that vibrated through the floorboards. The dashboard illuminated, casting a soft glow across my hands. My hands were perfectly steady. I put the car in gear and drove toward the iron gates of the estate. The flashing blue and red lights of 3 approaching patrol cruisers reflected in the dark windows of the venue. I signaled my turn, merged onto the empty highway, and drove back toward Boston. I did not look in the rearview mirror, even once. 6 months later, the Massachusetts autumn arrived crisp and bright. The thick humidity of summer vanished, replaced by a sharp, clear chill that turned the leaves over the Boston Common into brilliant shades of copper and gold. I sat in the corner office of my newly expanded corporate headquarters, holding a warm cup of black coffee. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, I watched the morning sunlight reflect off the downtown skyline. The view belonged to me. The building belonged to me. The quiet, unshakable peace settling deep inside my chest belonged to me. The aftermath of that ruined wedding reception moved with swift, surgical precision. Billionaires do not make empty threats, and Richard proved to be a man of terrifying efficiency. David filed for an annulment exactly 48 hours after the ballroom lights flickered off. He cited fraudulent inducement. The legal maneuver severed their union instantly, erasing Jessica from his life before she could even unpack her custom lace bridal gown. David walked away with his pristine financial record intact, free from the toxic anchor my sister tried to tie around his neck. Jessica faced a much harsher reality. Richard deployed his elite team of corporate litigators to dismantle her illusion piece by piece. They handed the printed ledger, the offshore routing numbers, and the fake hospitality business portfolio directly to federal prosecutors. The authorities do not look kindly upon individuals who funnel $500,000 into the Cayman Islands to fund luxury shopping sprees. Jessica was formally indicted for wire fraud and identity theft. During her trial, my sister attempted to deploy her usual tactics. She wept at the defense table. She played the naive, overwhelmed victim. She spun elaborate tales about family misunderstandings and good intentions. The federal judge did not care about her tears. The judge cared about the undeniable arithmetic of the bank transfers. Jessica was convicted and sentenced to 3 years in a minimum security facility in Danbury. She traded her stolen diamond necklaces and imported silk dresses for a standard-issue khaki uniform. Today, the golden child who once smirked and called me a worthless waitress spends her afternoons doing prison laundry and sweeping the cafeteria floors. The irony is sharp and permanent. Patricia experienced her own devastating descent. True to my word, the eviction process began that following Monday morning. My attorney, Helen Morrison, arrived at the sprawling Worcester estate, accompanied by local law enforcement officers and a stack of notarized court orders. My mother had assumed I was bluffing. She genuinely believed her biological title would shield her from the consequences of her cruelty. She thought I would falter at the last second. I did not falter. I sat at my mahogany desk in Boston, reviewing vendor logistics, while Helen supervised the removal of my mother's belongings. Patricia had 30 days to vacate the premises, but her social exile happened overnight. The elite Massachusetts circles operate on a ruthless, unspoken code. Wealth and status forgive many minor transgressions, but public fraud and unpaid catering invoices represent terminal offenses. The local country club revoked my mother's membership within a week. The prestigious Women's Charity Board demanded her immediate resignation. The women she had spent decades trying to impress stopped returning her phone calls and blocked her number. Stripped of her fake high society armor, Patricia was forced to downsize into a cramped, dreary one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. The rental sits perilously close to a noisy interstate highway. She had to cram her remaining designer coats into a tiny, mildew-scented closet. She calls my personal cell phone every single Tuesday afternoon. She leaves long, rambling voicemails filled with weeping apologies, begging for a second chance, pleading for a small financial loan to help her cover basic utilities. I listened to the first 10 seconds of her desperate performance, pressed the delete button, and returned to my spreadsheets. I never answer her calls. A boundary is only effective if you enforce it with iron consistency. I did not keep the Worcester estate. The sprawling house held far too many ghosts. It contained too many memories of my college textbooks sitting in black garbage bags on the freezing porch. It held the echoes of a mother choosing a failed boutique loan over her own daughter's future. I listed the property on the commercial real estate market the moment Patricia handed over the keys. The estate sold in less than 3 weeks. A commercial developer purchased the land with plans to demolish the structure and build luxury townhomes. Watching the bulldozers tear down the very foundation of my childhood, pain provided a profound cleansing catharsis. I took the millions generated from the sale and channeled every single dollar into a venture my grandfather William would have championed. I established the William Legacy Foundation. It operates as a robust, heavily funded nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting young women entering the logistics, finance, and premium hospitality sectors. We provide full tuition scholarships, mentorship programs, and seed capital for female entrepreneurs who lack traditional safety nets. We find the girls working double shifts at local diners. We locate the young women balancing community college classes with full-time jobs. We elevate the invisible workers who know how to calculate margins and build empires from scratch. I took the wealth Patricia tried to hoard and used it to fund the exact type of woman she despised. Looking out over the Boston skyline, I realized the most powerful weapon I ever possessed was the very thing my family forced upon me. I built an entire kingdom from the scraps they threw away. I navigated the hostile corporate landscape, secured multi-million-dollar contracts, and purchased my own freedom without ever raising my voice. I did not scream to demand their respect. I did not beg for a seat at their table. I simply built my own table and bought the building that housed it. If you are listening to this story and you recognize yourself in my journey, pay close attention. If you have ever been the invisible child, the scapegoat, forced to carry the heavy emotional weight while someone else receives all the glory, hear this truth. Your silence isn't weakness. It is your greatest asset. When toxic people underestimate your intelligence, they stop watching your hands. They leave you alone in the shadows, assuming you lack the capacity to grow. Use that shadow. Build your knowledge in the dark. Learn the systems, read the fine print, and save your capital. Let them laugh at your simple clothes. Let them mock your quiet demeanor. Let them construct their fragile, arrogant illusions. You do not need to fight them in the mud. You only need to build a flawless structure and wait for them to walk into it. Because eventually the lavish dinners must be paid for. The stolen funds must be accounted for. The bill always comes due. And the arithmetic never, ever lies.